Welcome back to Trumpet World. My name is Richard Palmer, Assistant Managing Editor of thetrumpet.com, and Hitler and the Nazis are back in the USA. That is what we've heard from European news for more than a week now. But a massive and shocking piece of news from Amsterdam last Friday exposes that as a lie. If we're worried about neo-Nazis, it's not the United States White House that we need to look. It is radical Muslim immigrants that have come into Europe en masse and are being permitted to carry out just extraordinary attacks on Jews that come straight out of the 1930s. Last Thursday, Israel's Maccabi football team faced off against the Dutch Ajax in Amsterdam. A lot of Israeli fans came to watch that match. After the game, we saw shocking footage come out of mobs hunting down Israelis and really just anyone that is Jewish for that reason alone. There was all kinds of footage of people hunting down, demanding to see passports for people to prove whether they were Israelis. There were mobs lying in wait for people on street corners. There were reports of cars deliberately trying to ram individuals. And we saw some incredibly disappointing responses from all kinds of authorities. We saw very quickly major media outlets around the world, including the BBC, trying to kind of put more blame on the Jews and shift the narrative, try and make it sound like the Jews had provoked this, that these Israeli football fans had behaved aggressively and provoked this, when A, there was very little evidence, and of course B, tearing down a few flags or making some chants the way that they were accused does not justify that kind of violence. Instead, what we have seen since then is this looked like quite an orchestrated, premeditated attack, largely made up of Dutch Arab Uber drivers. So there were WhatsApp messages, Telegram messages that we've now seen where they're messaging each other saying things like, tomorrow after the match at night, part 2, Jew hunt. And they're coordinating how to target all of these Israelis and Jews that were coming here. One of the first attacks came near a casino where a lot of these Israeli fans were staying, where the security guard had been sending messages to a lot of these Uber drivers and had been part of it. And this helped kick off a lot of that violence. By the time the evening was over, 5 people had been hospitalized, dozens more were injured. There were fears that Jews had been kidnapped, that you could have a potential hostage situation. There were worries that people were missing. The Israeli government was so concerned that they sent planes to go and evacuate Israeli citizens, which is just astonishing. Like, this is not Israel having to send in aeroplanes to bring its Jews out of Syria or out of some North African country where you might typically think about having this unrest. This was a Western, sophisticated European capital. The type of place that you'd have thought had really committed to never again. And what made this all the more poignant was that this attack came just a couple of days before the anniversary of Kristallnacht. This start or milestone in Germany's persecution of the Jews in the lead up to World War II. And this happened in the home of Anne Frank. This is a place that has put a lot of effort into memorializing the Holocaust and that attack on Jews. And yet this kind of violence, this kind of attack was allowed to happen again. I think there's a couple of important takeaways from this. I mean, one is these attacks, this was not Dutch citizens, and these were not, you look at the videos, and it's not tall, blonde-haired, Dutch-looking individuals chasing down Jews. They all are clearly from a Middle Eastern background. The mainstream media will shy away from reporting that or saying, well, Muslim-looking, Middle Eastern-looking. But this is a way, very clearly, that Europe's approach to immigration is undermined never again. That they are importing people with very radical ideologies into Europe. And that, I think, is an important takeaway. But at the same time, you do have this response that I alluded to from the mainstream, from the media, from authorities, that allowed this to happen. I mean, you look at the Dutch police, and you had reports even coming back in October where some whistleblowers spoke out. They said that there were colleagues that no longer wanted to protect Jewish targets or events. So, where the Dutch police, this was ahead of the attack. This wasn't in context of that particular attack. But if the Dutch police are saying we don't want to defend Holocaust museums because we don't want to be defending Jews, did that impact how well policed this event was in Amsterdam? So you see it in the Dutch authorities' response. And like I said, I think you see it in the way that this was reported around the world, and that there was a big push from left-wing media outlets initially to try and blame the Jews for somehow triggering this, which is exactly the same way that they responded to October 7th. Like, you get this massive, outrageous attack from terrorists with a Nazi ideology, and immediately a lot of the media try to make out that somehow it's the Jews' fault. You had the same thing in Amsterdam. And of course, the news comes out many days later showing actually these attacks were premeditated. They came several days in advance, that people were planning these attacks. This wasn't a response to what Jews were doing. But I think also, just like, this is from a New York Times article, even after this came out, where it talks about Israelis desecrating the Palestinian flag. I mean, the way that they described that just really got me. I mean, how many videos have you seen of radicals across the Middle East burning the Israeli flag? And that's never described as desecration in the Western media. So yes, a lot of this story is about imported anti-Semitism from the Middle East. But when you look at some of this response from authorities and from the media outside, and media outside of the Netherlands as well, and you also have a story of more institutionalized anti-Semitism and authorities that, okay, maybe they're not actively conspiring to attack Jews, but they don't really have a massive problem with it happening. And I think that also shows, has Europe really learned the message of never again? And Simon wrote a lot of this up. I've been summarizing his article, and he's sitting right next to me because we're going to go to the Middle East later in this discussion. I would like to bring you into this now. See, do you have anything to add? Anything of significance that I've missed out, because you got into this story in quite a bit of detail?
There may have been, I guess you could say, willful negligence on the part of some of the Dutch authorities. The Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, sent warnings to their counterparts in the Netherlands that something like what we saw was going to happen. And apparently the Dutch authorities, the federal authorities, just let it slide. And the mayor of Amsterdam, for her part, said, yeah, we got no warning from anybody higher up from us that anything like this was going to happen. And there is an investigation going on right now in the Netherlands to see what exactly went wrong. But an Israeli team coming into a big European city with a large Muslim population, at the very least, it should not have taken a warning from the Mossad for at least some people to be wondering something like this could go a bit dangerous, and at the very least take some of those warnings seriously. That didn't happen, and there are a lot of questions as to why not. Tying in with the overall context, I think it's interesting if you look at parallels, say, with Kristallnacht. We look at that today as like that was one step before Auschwitz. Like, it was the building block, etc. At the time, I mean, Hitler was in power for a few years now. Everybody knew that he was a dictator and he did not like the Jews. But a lot of people in Germany and a lot of people observing outside of Germany looked at that and going, whoa, that was way too far. Look at those barbarian, those brown shirts or whoever, doing this thing to these innocent people, and to the point that where Hitler gave a speech not too long after, and he didn't even reference what had happened. He talked about other things because he knew how controversial it was. Even, again, if this is just or mainly a problem within the radical Islamist community within the Netherlands, just because there's a lot of people that are outraged about this, and there are a lot of people in the Netherlands, including the government there, that are really shocked at what happened and are wondering why it happened and condemning this and thinking about ways to move things forward. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this was a one-off episode and that everything's stable except for maybe the small segment of society and we're going to be fixing the problem immediately. It's symptomatic of the global climate that we're in, with all the protests we've seen in other European capitals like London and Paris of hundreds of thousands of people desecrating the Israeli flags and a lot of other things, and the government letting that go, and a lot of ordinary people being among the, shall we say, the jihadi crowd.
I think that's a good point. Like it's a two-pronged problem. It is a radical Muslim being in Islam being imported into Europe problem, no question. But and this is way more than a Dutch issue. If this was any other group being targeted like this, you would see a much bigger response from the mainstream. So it also exposes a mainstream attitude towards the Jews. I mean, if this was Christian mob running amok, hunting down homosexuals after some kind of homosexual pride event, if it had had 1/100th of the violence, this would have been, I think, front page probably every day since then. Like,
We'd probably be talking about it for years.
yeah, exactly. And there would be, there were 63 arrests, I think, from this. Maybe there's been more since then. I think you mentioned in your article those arrests were mostly related to things that happened prior to that running amok. But you would have thousands of arrests if this had been, say, a Christian group targeting homosexuals. If it had been Muslims that had been attacked by some other group, again, I think this would be absolutely, absolutely massive. I mean, you look at in Britain with Sir Keir Starmer, or Tootir Keir, as he's been christened, how many people have been arrested for the so-called anti-Muslim riots that took place over the summer? And they were a lot less violent. I said it was a lot less one-sided. There was some violence. There was violence on both sides, people confronting each other. But I don't think there were as many people hospitalized as went on in the Netherlands and things like that. So, this was a bigger deal than what we saw over the summer in Britain, and yet we have seen the government go and arrest people for what they put on Twitter. And just this week, there was a prominent Telegraph journalist. The police showed up on her door on Remembrance Day, the day we remember those that died in world wars to preserve freedom. And the police are knocking on her door saying, "You've been accused of a hate crime." She thinks it's related to coverage of that attack. She said, "Well, who's my accuser? What am I accused of?" They said, "Well, we're not allowed to tell you what you're accused of. And in fact, you can't call your accuser. They're the victim." So the police have apparently judged her guilty before she stood trial. That's the kind of thing we saw when there was accusations of violence against Islam. But when it's violence against Jews, we'll move on. Like it became a big news item for a day. People have kind of forgotten about it already. There is no big outcry. And of course, this is sorry, go on.
Okay. The Free Press actually had a really good take on it. They, fortunately, cannot remember the guy's name, but they had a columnist who was a member of the Netherlands Jewish community. And their take was they're surprised that more people are surprised at what happened, because the Netherlands, as well as many other countries, has been struggling with this kind of problem for years, with blatant jeering about being Jews from people on the street. And the government's usual response to that is maybe a barbed wire and bulletproof glass in synagogues, and then outreach programs for interfaith dialogue. When people are trying to kill you, interfaith dialogue is I guess you could say, a cop-out excuse for, we don't really want to deal with the problem. We don't think it's that serious enough. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing.
If you live in Europe and have never visited a synagogue, it is eye-opening to go to I remember the first time I went to a synagogue about 2 decades ago. This is not new. This is not new at all. I mean, maybe a decade and a half. And it's one of the highest security buildings I'd ever been to. You can't have a window that is not barred, and the whole perimeter has to have a fence with a single point of entry. And if you've got people coming and going, generally you'll have to have someone on guard. That was 15 years ago. Synagogues in Britain have to be fortified compounds almost, because of the attacks that are just part of a normal part of that. And again, if any other community had to live like that, that wouldn't be tolerated, and it would be thought of as shit. And I had no idea that is what synagogues were generally like until I visited one. And it is a much wider systemic problem. Even going back to some of these attacks, you had like a Jewish youth soccer team in Berlin around the same time having to be put under police protection after they were attacked by a pro-Palestinian mob. And they were shouting, they were chasing people with knives, spat at during the game. France is, I was reading an article a few days ago, they're ramping up their security as they're preparing for an Israeli game there. If you remember the Olympics, the Israeli team had to have all kinds of extra security as they were going on. So Islam and this Europe has imported a massive problem in the form of radical Islam, and the mainstream and the wider culture has turned a blind eye. So it's a dual problem, and I think we will see as a result of this is spurring people to stand up to radical Islam in Europe. And we've talked about this trend before where we do expect Europe to become a much more Christian and much more Catholic place. And so much of that is a result to problems caused by radical Islam. And I think that is shifting Europe in a different direction. You've already seen Geert Wilders, who leads the largest party in the Dutch coalition. He didn't end up being the prime minister. He's very concerned of what is happening here. He said, he called this a pogrom in the streets of Amsterdam. He said, "We've become the Gaza of Europe, Muslims with Palestinian flags hunting down Jews. I will not accept that, never. The authorities will be held accountable for their failure to protect the Israeli citizens, never again." So he's acknowledging problems in the Dutch authorities and he's promising change. So I think this will push Europe in that more right-wing Christian direction, that we'll deal with a lot of genuine problems, I think, at least initially, but you're going to see Catholicism now play a much larger role in Europe, and ultimately that's going to spur Europe into conflict with the Middle East, and that's going to lead to some massive, wide-ranging changes in Europe that go far beyond standing up for the Jewish population, and actually ultimately lead to Europe being involved in the Holy Land in a very different way to that. So that is an important trend to watch there. And then also we've raised this point before, that you want to know if crisis is coming in the world. One very good way of looking at that is to look at how the world treats its Jews. It's an excellent barometer. You see this time and time again. And part of that is when people are unsettled, when their lives aren't going well, when there are major problems, they look for a scapegoat. Part of that is it is a spiritual barometer. And I had an article earlier this year, Truth and Lies, about anti-Semitism. There's a spiritual reality behind this that we need to understand if we're going to understand what is happening in these kind of attacks. So the Bible reveals there is a very real spirit world. And it talks about, you go to the Old Testament and it talks about evil spirits influencing world leaders. You look at the example of Jesus Christ, and he's constantly very aware of that evil spirit world and casting out demons and all of that. And Christians today don't talk about that very much and don't turn to those scriptures. But if you believe the Bible, that is very much in there and something that we need to understand. And you look at the role that the Jews have played in preserving the Bible, in preserving the holy days, preserving the Sabbath. Paul wrote that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. God used them to preserve Scripture so that we have there. And then Jesus Christ chose to come as the descendant or to be born of a Jewish woman. Like, there's a whole lot of honor that God has heaped on the Jews, and so that means that Satan has a special hatred for them. And so as you see Satan being more involved in world news, and him being allowed to be more involved in world news, and here we talked last week, and we'll talk a little bit more in a second, about he's raising up a Holy Roman Empire in Europe that he's going to use to punish the modern day descendants of Israel, or he's going to use to attack the modern day descendants of Israel. One symptom of that is rising anti-Semitism, and that spiritual reality also plays an important part of that. I think that's also an important explanation for what we're seeing and why society considers it appropriate or doesn't have a massive problem with Jews being attacked. It's a much wider problem than just radical Islam. And it is the fact that it is that much wider problem is a sign of the rising Holy Roman Empire. And I think that's why we're seeing this going on in Europe right now.